Alright, welcome everybody to this edition of Jay's Retro Toys and Games. It's Friday night on this September 22nd, 2023. It's episode 68, and we're continuing our look at the consoles of the retro times. We're continuing our look at the Atari company, and tonight we're looking at the one that made history, a successful one for the Atari company. Yes, we're looking at the Atari 2600, that the video game console developed and produced by the Atari Inc., released in September of 1977 to popularized microprocessor-based hardware and games stored on swappable ROM cartridges, a format first used with the Fairchild Channel F in 1976, branded as the Atari Video Computer System from its release until November of 1982, and the VCS was bundled with two joystick controllers, a conjoined pair of paddle controllers, and a game cartridge, initially Combat and later Pac-Man. Let's look at it right now, coming up next on episode 68 of Jay's Retro Toys and Games. Welcome everybody to the show tonight. Hope you're having a fantastic week as we go into the weekend. Episode 68 is upon us and ready to go on this September 22nd, 2023. I'm your host, Jason DeCanio, and we thank you very much for tuning in to this edition of Jay's Retro Toys and Games for Season 3. And we're off to a little bit of a slow start, but I think it's because of you had so much fun with Masters of the Universe, and I can understand that. You know, I really can. But for all time's sake, let's get the views back to where they were and definitely get you on the move here. We're talking about the Atari 2600 tonight, and I think it's fitting to note that, you know, Atari was successful at creating the arcade video games, and they really set the foundation for everything that's come its way. So you really have to go back. But remember, it didn't start with Atari. It started with Magnavox's home theater, home gaming system. That's the ones who really started it off in 1972. And then Atari really just kind of picked up where they left off. Their development costs and limited lifespan drove CEO Nolan Bushnell to seek a programmable home system, and the first inexpensive microprocessors from MOS Technology in late 1975 made this feasible. The console was prototyped as codename Stella by Atari's subsidiary Cyan Engineering. Lacking funding to complete the project, Bushnell sold Atari to Warner Communications in 1976. So today we're going to be looking at the 4-switch VCS models, the ones that came around September of 1977 and were available to the public until 1982. Okay? So the Atari VCS launched in 1977 with 9 simple low-resolution games and 2 KB cartridges. The system's first killer app was the home conversion of Taito's arcade game Space Invaders in 1980. The VCS became widely successful, leading to the founding of Activision and other third-party game developers and to competition from console manufacturers Mattel and Coleco. By the end of its primary life cycle in 83 to 84, games for the 2600 were using more than 4 times the storage size of the launch games, with significantly more advanced visuals and gameplay than the system was designed for, such as Activision's Pitfall. In 1982, the Atari 2600 was the dominant game system in North America. Amid competition from both newer consoles and game developers, a number of poor decisions from Atari management affected the company and the industry as a whole. The most public was an extreme investment into licensed games for the 2600, including Pac-Man and E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Pac-Man became the system's biggest selling game, but the conversion's poor quality eroded consumer confidence in the console. E.T. was rushed to the market for the holiday shopping season and was critically panned and a commercial failure. Both games and a glut of third-party shovelware were factors in ending Atari's relevance in the console market. Atari's downfall reverberated through the industry, resulting in the video game crash of 1983. Warner sold Atari's home division to former Commodore CEO Jack Tramiel in 1984. In 86, the new Atari Corporation under Tramiel released a lower-cost version of the 2600 and the backward-compatible Atari 7800. But it was Nintendo that led the recovery of the industry with its 1985 launch of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Production of the Atari 2600 ended on January 1st, 1992, with an estimated 30 million units sold across its lifetime. As you know, the history of Atari was founded by Nolan Bushnell and Ted DeBaney in 1972. We now fast forward to building the system. This is where we're really going, right here. By December of 1975, Atari hired Joe DeCura, a recent graduate from University of California, Berkeley, who had been doing his own testing on the 6502. DeCura began debugging the first prototype designed by Mayer and Milner, which gained the codename Stella after the brand of DeCura's bicycle. This prototype included a breadboard-level design of the graphics interface to build upon. A second prototype was completed in March of 1976 with the help of Jay Miner, who created a chip called the Television Interface Adapter, or the TIA, to send graphics and audio to a television. The second prototype included a TIA, a 6507, and a ROM cartridge slot adapter. So, the MOS Technology debuted in September of 1975, and they continued through October. And then, of course, as the TIA's design was refined, AI Alcorn, or Al Alcorn, brought in the Atari's game developers to provide input on features. There are significant limitations in the 6507, the TIA, and other components, so the programmers creatively optimized their games to maximize the console. The console lacks a frame buffer and requires games to instruct the system to generate graphics in synchronization with the electron gun in the cathode ray tube as it scans across rows on the screen. The programmers found ways to race the beam to perform other functions while the electron gun scans outside of the visible screen. Alongside the electronics development, Bushnell brought in Gene Landrum, a consultant who had just prior consulted for Fairchild Camera and Instrument for its upcoming Channel F, to determine the consumer requirements for the console. In his final report, Landrum suggested a living room aesthetic with a wood grain finish, and the cartridges must be idiot-proof, child-proof, and effective in resisting potential static electricity problems in a living room environment. Landrum recommended it include 4 to 5 dedicated games in addition to the cartridges, but this was dropped in the final designs. The cartridge design was done by James Asher and Douglas Hardy. Hardy had been an engineer for Fairchild and helped in the initial design of the Channel F cartridges, but he quit to join Atari in 1976. The interior of the cartridge that Asher and Hardy designed was sufficiently different to avoid patent conflicts, but the interior components were directly influenced by the Channel F to help work around the static electricity concerns. Atari was still recovering from its 1974 financial woes and needed additional capital to fully enter the home console market, though Bushnell was wary of being beholden to outside financial sources. Atari obtained smaller investments through 1975, but not at the scale it needed, and began considering a sale to a larger firm by early 1976. Atari was introduced to Warner Communications, which saw the potential for the growing video game industry to help offset declining profits from its film and music divisions. Negotiations took place during 1976, during which Atari cleared itself of liabilities, including settling a patent infringement lawsuit with Magnavox over Ralph H. Baer's patents that were the basis for the Magnavox Odyssey. In mid-76, Fairchild announced that the Channel F planned for release later that year, beating Atari to the market. By October of 76, Warner and Atari agreed to purchase to the purchase of Atari for $28 million, and Warner provided an estimated $120 million, which was enough to fast-track Stella. By 1977, development had advanced enough to brand it the Atari Video Computer System, or the VCS, and start developing games. This unit was showcased on June 4th, 1977 at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show with plans for retail release in October. The announcement was purposely delayed to wait out the terms of the Magnavox patent lawsuit resettlement, which would have given Magnavox all technical information on any of Atari's products announced between June 1st of 76 and June 1st of 77. However, Atari encountered production problems during its first batch, and its testing was complicated by the use of cartridges. The Atari VCS was launched in September of 77 at $199, equivalent to about $960 in 2022, with 2 joysticks and a combat cartridge. 8 additional games were sold separately. Most of the launch games were based on arcade games developed by Atari or its subsidiary Key Games, that's KEE. For example, Combat was based on Key's Tank, 74, and Atari's Jet Fighter from 75. Atari sold between 350,000 and 400,000 Atari VCS units during 77, attributed to the delay in shipping the units and consumers' unfamiliarity with the swappable cartridge console that is not dedicated to only one game. In 1978, Atari sold only 550,000 of the 800,000 systems manufactured. This required further financial support from Warner to cover losses. Atari sold 1 million consoles in 79, particularly during the holiday season, but there were new competition from the Mattel Electronics Intellivision and Magnavox Odyssey, which also use swappable ROM cartridges. Atari obtained a license from Taito to develop a VCS conversion of its 1978 arcade hit Space Invaders. This is the first officially licensed arcade conversion for a home console, and its release in March of 1980 doubled the console's sales for the year to more than 2 million units and was considered the Atari VCS's killer application. Sales then doubled again for the next 2 years, and by 1982, 10 million consoles had been sold in the United States, while its best-selling game was Pac-Man, at over 8 million copies sold by 1990. Pac-Man propelled worldwide Atari VCS sales to 12 million units during 1982, eventually selling 15 million consoles worldwide by the end of the year. In Europe, the Atari VCS sold 125,000 units in the United Kingdom during 1980 and 450,000 in West Germany by 1984. In France, where the VCS released in 1982, the system sold 600,000 units by 89. The console was distributed by Epic Company in Japan in 79 under the name Cassette TV Game, but not sell as well as Epic's own Cassette Vision system in 1981. In 1982, Atari launched its second programmable console, the Atari 5200. To standardize naming, the VCS was renamed to the Atari 2600 Video Computer System, or Atari 2600, derived from the manufacturer part number CX2600. By 1982, the 2600 cost Atari about $40 to make and was sold for an average of $125, or the equivalent to $380 in 2022. The company spent $4.50 to $6 to manufacture each cartridge, plus $1 to $2 for advertising, wholesaling for $18.95. That's the equivalent to $60 today in 2022. Activision, formed by Crane, Whitehead, and Miller in 79, started developing third-party VCS games using their knowledge of VCS design and program tricks, and began releasing games in 1980. Kaboom! And Pitfall from 81 and 82 are among the most successful, with at least 1 and 4 million copies sold, respectively. In 1980, Atari attempted to block the sale of the Activision cartridges, accusing the four of intellectual property infringement. The two companies settled out of court, with Activision agreeing to pay Atari a licensing fee for their games, and this made Activision the first third-party video game developer and established the licensing model that continues to be used by console manufacturers for game development. Activision's success led to the establishment of other third-party VCS game developers following Activision's model in the early 80s, including US Games, Telesystems, Games by Apollo, Data Age, Zimag, Mystique, and Comavid. The founding of Imagic included ex-Atari programmers Mattel and Coleco, each already producing its own, more advanced console. Created simplified versions of their existing games for the 2600, and Mattel used the M Network brand name for its cartridges. Third-party games accounted for half of VCS game sales by 1982. In addition to third-party game development, Atari also received the first major threat to its hardware dominance from the ColecoVision. Coleco had a license from Nintendo to develop a version of the arcade game Donkey Kong in '81, which was bundled with every ColecoVision console. Coleco gained about 17% of the hardware market in 1982 compared to Atari's 58%. With third parties competing for market share, Atari worked to maintain dominance in the market by acquiring licenses for popular arcade games and other properties to make games from. Pac-Man has numerous technical and aesthetic flaws, but nevertheless more than 7 million copies were sold. Heading into 1982, the holiday shopping season, Atari had placed high sales expectations on E.T. the Extraterrestrial, a game programmed in about 6 weeks. Atari produced an estimated 4 million cartridges, but the game was poorly reviewed and only about 1.5 million units were sold. Warner Communications reported weaker results than expected in December of '82 to its shareholders, having expected a 50% year-to-year growth but only obtaining 10 to 15% due to declining sales at Atari. Coupled with the oversaturated home game market, Atari's weakened position led investors to start pulling funds out of video games, beginning a cascade of disastrous effects known as the video game crash of 1983. Many of the third-party developers formed prior to 1983 were closed, and Mattel and Coleco left the video game market by 1985. September of 1983, Atari sent 14 truckloads of unsold Atari 2600 cartridges and other equipment to a landfill in the New Mexico desert, later labeled the Atari Video Game Burial. Long considered an urban legend that claimed the burial contained millions of unsold cartridges, the site was excavated in 2014, confirming reports from former Atari executives that only about 700,000 cartridges had actually been buried. Atari reported a $536 million loss for 1983 as a whole and continued to lose money into 1984, with a $425 million loss reported in the second quarter. By mid-1984, software development for the 2600 had essentially stopped except that of Atari and Activision. Warner, wary of supporting its failing Atari division, started looking for buyers in 1984. Warner sold most of the Atari to Jack Tramiel, the founder of Commodore International, in July of '84 for about $240 million, though Warner retained Atari's arcade business. Tramiel was a proponent of personal computers and halted all new 2600 game development soon after the sale. The North American video game market did not recover until about 1986 after Nintendo's 1985 launch of the NES in North America. Atari Corporation released a redesigned model of the 2600 in 1986, supported by an ad campaign touting a price of under $50. With a large library of cartridges and a low price point, the 2600 continued to sell into the late 1980s. Atari released the last batch of games in 89 to 90, including Secret Quest and Fatal Run. By 1986, over 20 million Atari VCS units had been sold worldwide. The final Atari licensed release is the PAL-only version of the arcade game Klax in 1990. And after more than 14 years on the market, the 2600 line was formally discontinued on January 1st, 1992, along with the 7800 and Atari 8-bit family of home computers. In Europe, last stocks of the 2600 were sold until summer-fall of 1995. So the Atari's 2600 CPU is the MOS Technology 6507. It's a version of the 6502 running at about 1.19 megahertz in the 2600. Though their internal silicon was identical, the 6507 was cheaper than the 6502 because its package included fewer memory address pins. 13 instead of 16. The designers of the Atari 2600 selected an inexpensive cartridge interface that has one fewer address than the 13 allowed by the 6507, further reducing the already limited addressable memory to 4 kilobytes. This was believed to be sufficient as combat is itself only 2 kilobytes. Later games circumvented this limitation with bank switching. The console has 128 bytes of RAM for scratch space, the call stack, and the state of the game environment. The top bezel of the console originally had 6 switches: power, TV type selection, color or black and white, game selection, player difficulty, and game reset. The difficulty switches were moved to the back of the bezel in later versions of the console. The back bezel also included the game controller ports, TV output, and the power out input. The Atari 2600 was designed to be compatible with the cathode ray tube television sets produced in the late 70s and early 80s, which commonly lack auxiliary video inputs to receive audio and video from another device. Therefore, to connect to a TV, the console generates a radio frequency signal compatible with the regional television standards, using a special switch box to act as the TV's antenna. Atari developed a television interface adapter chip in the VCS to handle the graphics and conversion to a television signal. It provides a single-color 20-bit background register that covers the left half of the screen. Each bit represents 4 adjacent pixels and is either repeated or reflected on the right side. There are 5 single-color sprites, 2 8-pixel wide players, 2 1-bit missiles, which share the same colors as the players, and a 1-pixel ball, which shares the background color. The 1-bit sprites also can be controlled to stretch to 1, 2, 4, or 8 pixels. The system was designed without a frame buffer to avoid the cost of the associated RAM. The background and sprites apply to a single scan line, and as the display is output to the television, the program can change colors, sprite positions, and background settings. The careful timing required to sync the code to the screen on the part of the programmer was labeled "racing the beam." The actual game logic runs when the television beam is outside of the visible area of the screen. Early games for the system used the same visuals for pairs of scan lines, giving a lower vertical resolution to allow more time for the next row of graphics to be prepared. Later games, such as Pitfall, changed the visuals for each scan line, or extend the black areas around the screen to extend the game's code's processing time. Regional releases of the Atari 2600 used modified TIA chips for each region's television formats, which require games to be developed and published separately for each region. All modes are 160 pixels wide. NTSC mode provides 192 visible lines per screen, drawn at 60 Hz, with 16 colors, each at 8 levels of brightness. PAL mode provides more vertical scan lines with 228 visible lines per screen, but drawn at 50 Hz and only 13 colors. SECAM, the CCAM mode, also a 50 Hz format, is limited to 8 colors each with only a single brightness level. The first VCS bundle has 2 types of controllers: a joystick, part number CX10, and a pair of rotary paddle controllers, CX30. The driving controllers, which are similar to paddle controllers but can be continuously rotated, shipped with the Indy 500 launch game. After less than a year, the CX10 joystick was replaced with the CX40 mode, or the 40 model, designed by James C. Asher. Because the Atari joystick port and the CX40 joystick became industry standards, 2600 joysticks and some other peripherals work with later systems, including the MSX, the Commodore 64, the Amiga, the Atari 8-bit family, and Atari ST. The CX40 joystick can be used with the Master System and Sega Genesis, but does not provide all the buttons of a native controller. Third-party controllers include Wico's Command Control Joystick. Later, the CX42 remote control joysticks, similar in appearance but using wireless technology, were released together with a receiver whose wires could be inserted into the controller jacks. Atari introduced the CX50 keyboard controller in June of '78, along with 2 games that require it, Codebreaker and Hunt and Score. The similar but simpler CX23 Kids controller was released later for a series of games aimed at a younger audience. The CX22 trackball controller was announced in January of 1983, and is compatible with the Atari 8-bit family. There were 2 attempts to turn the 2600 into a keyboard-equipped home computer. Atari's never released CX3000 or the Graduate keyboard, and the CompuMate keyboard by Spectra Video, which was released in 1983. The initial production of the VCS made in Sunnyvale during 1977, using thick polystyrene plastic for the casing as to give the impression of weight from what was mostly an empty shell inside. The initial Sunnyvale batch had also included potential mounts for an internal speaker system on the casing, though the speakers were found to be too expensive to include, and instead sound was routed through the TIA to the connected television. All 6 console switches on the front panel. Production of the unit was moved to Taiwan in 1978, where a less thick internal metal shielding was used and thinner plastic was used for the casing, reducing the system's weight. These 2 versions are commonly referred to as heavy sixers and light sixers, respectively, referencing the 6 front switches. In 1980, the difficulty switches were moved to the back of the console, leaving 4 switches on the front. Otherwise, the 4-switch consoles look nearly identical to the earlier 6-switch models. And then in 1982, Atari rebranded the console as the Atari 2600, a name first used on a version of the 4-switch model without wood grain, giving it an all-black appearance. Now, Atari continued its OEM relationship with Sears under the latter's Telegames brand, which started in 1975 with the original Pong. This is unrelated to the company Telegames, which later produced 2600 cartridges. Sears released several models of the VCS as the Sears Video Arcade series starting in 1977. Then in 1983, the previously Japan-only Atari 2800 was rebranded as the Sears Video Arcade 2. Sears released versions of Atari's games with Telegames branding, usually with different titles. 3 games were produced by Atari for Sears as exclusive releases: Steeplechase, Stellar Track, and Submarine Commander. They also had the Atari 2800, which was its Japanese version, released in October of 1983. They had the 2600 Junior, which was the 1986 model, had a smaller, cost-reduced form factor with an Atari 7800-like appearance. It was advertised as a budget gaming system under $49.99 with the ability to run a large collection of games. Released after the video game crash of 1983 and after the North American launch of the Nintendo Entertainment System, the 2600 was supported with new games and television commercials promoting "The Fun is Back," and Atari released several minor stylistic variations. The large rainbow shone, the short rainbow, and an all-black version sold only in Ireland. Later, European versions included a joypad. There was the Atari 2700 that had the 2600 with wireless controllers, the CX2000 with integrated joystick controllers, and there was a redesign based on human factor analysis by Henry Dreyfuss Associates. The circa 1982 Atari 3200 was a backward-compatible 2600 successor. And the Atari 7800, announced in 1984, released in 1986, is the official successor to the Atari 2600 and is backward compatible with 2600 cartridges. Multiple microconsoles are based on the Atari 2600. The TV Boy includes 127 games and an enlarged joypad. The Atari Classics 10-in-1 TV game, manufactured by Jax Pacific, emulates the 2600 with 10 games inside an Atari-style joystick with the composite video output. The Atari Flashback 2 contains 40 games with 4 additional programs unlocked by a cheat code. It is compatible with original 2600 controllers and can be modified to play original 2600 cartridges. 2017, Hyperkin announced the Retron 77, which is a clone of the Atari 2600 that plays original cartridges instead of pre-installed games. The Atari VCS 2021 console can download and emulate 2600 games via an online store. And Atari Inc. plans to release the Atari's 2600 Plus, an 80% scale replica of the 1980 CX 2600A model, on November 17th of this year. we're going to stop there because we've had so much to ingest in our brains. When we come back on Monday's show, we'll be looking at episode number 69, which will talk about the games, the legacy, and finish up the Atari 2600 on Monday. Fantastic run for this console that had a span of 9 years. We thank you for joining us here tonight on Jay's Retro Toys and Games. We hope that you will always continue to support the channel, and remember to always be honest, be real, and keep it simple, stupid. KISS. We'll see you next week. Have a great weekend. Bye for now.